Welcome back, beautiful soul. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let me be your guide into the most restful sleep. But first, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so we can meet again tomorrow night. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're resting tonight and what kind of dreams you'd like me to weave for you next. Your sleep journey starts now. The geological survey map showed no chamber at that depth. I held the 1974 chart in one hand and my modern GPS device in the other on November 3, 2011, standing at the entrance to what locals called Blackwater Cavern in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Someone had deliberately removed an entire section of cave system from official records. The question that would cost me everything was simple. Why? My name is Dr. Rebecca Thornton, and I'd spent 17 years as a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, specializing in Appalachian cave formations. That morning, I was investigating reports of unusual seismic readings near an abandoned mining operation. What I found instead was a carefully orchestrated cover-up spanning 4 decades. The victim's name was Daniel Pritchard, though I wouldn't learn that for another 6 hours. He was 23 years old, a graduate student in environmental science from Virginia Tech, passionate about cave ecology and engaged to his high school sweetheart, Amy Rosenberg. His parents, Margaret and Thomas Pritchard, had been searching for answers since March 19, 1989, the day their son entered Blackwater Cavern and never came back. According to official reports, Daniel had gone caving alone despite safety protocols, gotten lost in the unmapped sections, and likely died from exposure or injury in an inaccessible area. Case closed. The family received sympathy and a death certificate with no body. But Margaret Pritchard never stopped writing letters, never stopped demanding searches, never stopped insisting something was wrong. I discovered the discrepancy by accident. While comparing historical surveys for my seismic study, I noticed the 1974 map showed a large chamber system approximately 800 feet below the main entrance. Every map printed after 1989 showed solid limestone in that exact location. Someone had literally erased part of the cave from existence on paper. I spent 3 days gathering equipment and reviewing old mining records. The Blackwater mine had operated from 1952 to 1987, extracting coal from deep shafts that occasionally intersected natural cave systems. In 1988, the mining company, Consolidated Mountain Resources, had paid for a complete geological resurvey of the area. That survey, completed in January 1989, was the first to show no chamber at depth. 2 months later, Daniel Pritchard disappeared. On November 6th, I entered the cave with full climbing gear, 3 experienced cavers I trusted, and enough supplies for a 12-hour expedition. We followed the main passage down past the tourist sections, past the old mining access points, down to where the rock turned from gray limestone to black shale. At 763 feet below the surface, we found it, a narrow fissure, barely 18 inches wide, hidden behind a collapse that looked natural but wasn't. James Kowalski, my lead caver, examined the rock fall with his headlamp. "This was placed," he said quietly. "Look at the stress patterns. These boulders were moved here and wedged into position." We spent an hour carefully removing stones, and then we squeezed through into the chamber that didn't exist. The air hit us first, stale and chemical sweet. Then our lights found the drums. 47 industrial barrels, each marked with faded labels. Consolidated Mountain Resources, Chemical Waste, Disposal Authorization, CMR 88443. They were corroding, leaking thick black sludge into the pristine cave formations, into the underground water system that fed 17 towns across 2 counties. We found Daniel Pritchard 20 feet beyond the drums. His remains were partially buried under a rockfall that, like the entrance barrier, showed signs of deliberate placement. His caving pack was intact, and inside was a 35mm camera with film still loaded. His notebook, protected in a waterproof case, contained detailed documentation of the illegal dump site, water quality readings showing catastrophic contamination, and a statement dated March 19, 1989 at 2:15 p.m. Taking this evidence to EPA tomorrow, CMR has poisoned the groundwater for entire region. Criminal negligence, possibly deliberate. He never made it out. The last entry in his notebook, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, was timed at 6:30 p.m. the same day. Can't find exit. Headlamp dying. If anyone finds this, look at the cancer rates in Blackwater, Greenville, and Morrison Townships since 1988. This is murder. I photographed everything. The drums, the contamination, Daniel's remains, his evidence, every detail. We collected water samples showing toxic chemical levels 847 times above safe limits. James found Daniel's camera, and miraculously, we were able to develop the film. His photographs documented systematic illegal dumping, mining company trucks at the cave entrance, workers in CMR uniforms rolling barrels into the darkness. On November 9, 2011, I submitted my findings to the EPA, the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, the county sheriff, and the FBI. I contacted Margaret Pritchard and told her we'd found her son. I believed I was exposing a terrible crime. I believed justice would follow. Within 48 hours, my security clearance was suspended. A USGS internal investigation accused me of falsifying data, trespassing on private property, and contaminating a crime scene. The film from Daniel's camera was seized as evidence and subsequently lost in processing. My water samples were retested by a state lab and declared within acceptable parameters, a scientific impossibility given the readings I'd documented. The Pritchard family was contacted by Consolidated Mountain Resources legal team. The company, now a subsidiary of a massive energy corporation, offered them $2 million to sign a non-disclosure agreement and accept that Daniel had died in a tragic caving accident. Margaret refused. 1 week later, Thomas Pritchard was arrested on 30-year-old embezzlement charges that mysteriously resurfaced. He died of a heart attack in county jail on January 14, 2012, awaiting trial. Margaret signed the agreement to pay for his funeral. I was fired from the USGS on February 3, 2012, for gross misconduct and violation of professional ethics. My geology license was suspended. Every university I applied to for research positions rejected my applications. My marriage collapsed under the strain. My husband, David, couldn't handle the death threats that started arriving at our home, the cars that followed us, the midnight phone calls. James Kowalski retracted his statement about the deliberately placed rockfall. The other 2 cavers on my expedition refused to return my calls. The geological survey maps still show solid limestone where the chamber exists. Blackwater Cavern was closed to the public in 2012 for safety concerns, and the entrance was sealed with concrete. I've spent 13 years trying to get someone to listen. The cancer rates in those 3 townships are 140% above national average. Kidney disease, liver failure, rare blood disorders, all consistent with long-term chemical exposure. 63 people have died since 1989 from illnesses that shouldn't exist in a rural population with no industrial exposure. Daniel Pritchard tried to save them and was murdered for it. I'm living in Ohio now, working as a substitute teacher, using a different name for my own safety, but I still have copies of those photographs, stored in locations the company doesn't know about. I still have Daniel's notebook pages, scanned and encrypted. I'm reaching out because the truth matters more than my safety now. If you worked for Consolidated Mountain Resources between 1987 and 1990, if you remember the dumping operations, if you know what happened to Daniel Pritchard that night, please come forward. Margaret Pritchard died in 2019, never knowing justice for her son. The people of those townships are still drinking poisoned water. Someone else must remember. Someone else must care. The air pressure gauge was fluctuating in a pattern that shouldn't exist in a stable cave system. I watched the needle swing from 14.2 to 14.8 psi every 47 seconds on August 22, 2006, standing in the abandoned Copper Ridge mine in Carter County, Kentucky. My supervisor, William Brennan, had sent me down here to confirm structural stability before the state approved new development above ground. What I confirmed instead was that 12 men had been buried alive, and everyone involved had walked away rich. I'm Yolanda Martinez, licensed mine safety inspector with the Kentucky Department for Natural Resources. I'd been doing this work for 9 years, investigating old mines before construction projects, checking for subsidence risks and toxic gas buildup. I was thorough, maybe too thorough, which is probably why they targeted me specifically for what came next. The Copper Ridge mine had operated from 1948 to 1994, a relatively small copper extraction operation owned by Ridge Metal Industries. Official closure reports stated all tunnels had been properly sealed, all equipment removed, and the site abandoned according to regulatory standards. But the property developer applying for residential permits had detected unusual ground movement, so I was sent down with my equipment for a standard survey. The pressure fluctuations indicated something was moving large volumes of air in a rhythmic pattern deep within the mine structure. Natural geological processes don't create regular 47-second cycles. I followed the main shaft down 600 feet past abandoned equipment and rotting timber supports until I reached a section that made my blood freeze. Someone had used a bulldozer to collapse an entire tunnel section, but they'd done it hastily. Through gaps in the rubble, I could see fabric, canvas work clothes, rotted but still recognizable. I could see metal lunch boxes. I could see a human hand, mummified in the dry mine air, wearing a wedding ring. I started digging. The collapse had sealed off the eastern tunnel complex where, according to personnel records I'd reviewed, 12 workers had been stationed on October 8, 1994, the mine's last operational day. The official story was they'd all been evacuated safely, given severance pay, and the mine had closed in an orderly fashion. But these men had been working when thousands of tons of rock and earth were deliberately brought down on top of them. I found Victor Boone first, identifiable by his personalized hard hat. He was 37, father of 4 daughters, served in Desert Storm, coached Little League Baseball. His wallet contained photos of his girls, ages 6 to 14 in 1994. Beside him was Leonard Wu, age 42, immigrant from Taiwan, sending money home to support his elderly parents and younger siblings. His brother, Kenneth Wu, was 3 feet away, crushed beneath a support beam. The other bodies were scattered throughout the collapsed section. Raj Patel, age 29, newlywed. Marcus Jefferson, age 51, 3 months from retirement. Timothy O'Brien, age 25, saving for college. Brothers Sean and Patrick Gallagher, ages 39 and 41. David Ntakirutimana, age 33, refugee from Rwanda seeking a new life. Antonio Valdez, age 47. Sungmin Park, age 38. The 12th man, Luis Morales, age 27, was found clutching a letter he'd been writing to his mother. Their lunchboxes contained half-eaten sandwiches. Their work lamps were still lit when the ceiling came down. This wasn't an accident. This was execution. I discovered the why in the mine office records I accessed 3 days later. Ridge Metal Industries had been operating without proper safety permits for 17 months, violating dozens of regulations, ignoring structural warnings from their own engineers. In September 1994, a surprise inspection was scheduled for October 15th. If violations were found, the company faced $8 million in fines and potential criminal charges against executives. The 12 dead men were all scheduled to testify. They'd reported safety concerns, documented violations, threatened to contact authorities themselves if conditions weren't improved. Internal memos I found showed management discussing the problem employees and the liability of their testimony. The last memo, dated October 3, 1994, simply said, "Solution implemented. Closure proceeding as planned." On October 8th, all 12 men reported for their final shift. They were directed to the Eastern Tunnel Complex for equipment removal. At 11:23 a.m., according to seismic records from the University of Kentucky, a significant underground collapse occurred. At 2:47 p.m. the same day, Ridge Metal Industries announced the mine was closing immediately due to exhausted copper deposits, and all workers had been safely terminated with severance packages. The families were told their loved ones had taken the money and left, skipping town, abandoning responsibilities. Victor Boone's wife, Jennifer, was told her husband had run off with another woman. The Wu family in Taiwan was informed their sons had moved to California and wanted no further contact. 12 families were destroyed by lies on top of murder. I reported everything to my supervisor on August 25, 2006. William Brennan listened carefully, examined my evidence, and told me he'd elevate it immediately to state authorities. He congratulated me on thorough work. I felt like I'd finally made a real difference. On August 28th, I was called to a meeting with the department director, state legal counsel, and representatives from Ridge Metal Industries, now owned by a multinational mining corporation worth billions. They informed me my findings were inconclusive and my evidence had chain of custody issues. The bodies I'd found were dismissed as possible transient individuals who'd entered the abandoned mine illegally decades later. My photographs showing work clothes, identification, and company equipment were called insufficient for positive identification. I was offered a promotion, a transfer to a comfortable office job in Frankfurt, and a 40% raise. All I had to do was sign a revised report stating the mine was structurally sound with no evidence of human remains. When I refused, the meeting ended. I was escorted from the building. My car was run off the road on September 2, 2006 on Highway 60 near Moorhead. The driver never stopped. I survived with a broken collarbone and 3 cracked ribs. While I was in the hospital, my apartment was burglarized. Only my case files, photographs, and evidence samples were taken. Nothing else. I was terminated for falsifying official reports and bringing fraudulent claims on September 15th. My certifications were revoked. Criminal charges for evidence tampering were filed, then quietly dropped after I agreed to leave Kentucky. The Copper Ridge Mine entrance was sealed with concrete in October 2006, and the residential development was approved. I'm in New Mexico now, working retail, still looking over my shoulder. Those 12 men are still buried in that mine. Their families still don't know the truth. Jennifer Boone died in 2018, believing her husband had abandoned her and their daughters. If you worked for Ridge Metal Industries in 1994, if you remember what really happened that October, if you have documents or knowledge about the closure, please help me. These men deserve burial. Their families deserve truth. Someone else was there. Someone else knows. The surveying equipment was reading human remains as mineral deposits. I calibrated the ground-penetrating radar 3 times on July 14, 2003, working in the Mammoth Cave System extension in Edmonson County, Kentucky, and the signature was unmistakable. Organic material, human-sized, arranged in deliberate patterns 30 feet below the established cave floor. The mapping software kept flagging them as limestone formations, but I'd been analyzing cave geology for 14 years. I knew the difference between rock and bone. My name is Dr. Hassan Al-Rashid, and I was a senior cave cartographer with the National Speleological Society. contracted by the National Park Service to map newly discovered passages in the Mammoth cave system. Our team had located a virgin extension using advanced sonar technology. Passages that had been sealed by rockfalls for thousands of years, or so we thought. What we actually found was a mass grave disguised as a natural cave formation, hidden by park officials who valued tourism revenue over human life. The victim I'll focus on is Sarah Whitmore, though there were 18 others buried in that chamber. She was 31 years old, a park ranger stationed at Mammoth Cave from 1977 to 1981. Loved hiking and environmental education, planning to pursue a master's degree in conservation biology. Her family, parents Robert and Linda Whitmore, younger brother Jason, reported her missing on September 23, 1981. The official investigation concluded she'd been attacked by an unknown assailant while hiking outside the park. Her body never recovered. The case went cold. The truth was that Sarah Whitmore had discovered something in those sealed passages, something park administration had known about and concealed for decades, and when she threatened to expose it, she joined the others in the hidden chamber. I first suspected something was wrong when I reviewed historical cave maps from the 1950s. A passage designated as Devil's Corridor on 1952 surveys simply didn't appear on any map after 1954. Park records claimed it had been deemed unsafe and permanently sealed, but geological surveys showed no evidence of instability. Someone had decided that section of cave needed to disappear from public knowledge. On July 16, 2003, my team breached a collapsed section we'd been working to clear for 3 weeks. The air that rushed out was wrong, stale but chemical-tinged, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. We entered with full safety gear, lights, and documentation equipment. The passage opened into a chamber roughly 40 feet across, with ceiling heights varying from 6 to 12 feet. And covering nearly every surface were human remains. They'd been arranged carefully, almost reverently, positioned in natural depressions in the rock formations. The cave's constant temperature and low humidity had preserved them partially. Mummified skin, intact clothing, personal effects. 18 bodies total, spanning what forensic analysis would later suggest was a 40-year period from approximately 1941 to 1981. Sarah Whitmore was the most recent. Her park ranger uniform was still recognizable. Her badge present, S. Whitmore, Ranger 447. Her backpack contained a camera with undeveloped film, a notebook filled with observations, and a letter addressed to the National Park Service Director, dated September 22, 1981. In it, she detailed her discovery of this chamber, the evidence of previous burials, and her intention to report what she believed was a serial killer operating within park boundaries. She never mailed that letter. The other 17 victims were equally preserved by the cave environment. Hikers who disappeared across decades, their missing person cases all officially attributed to getting lost in the vast cave system or attacked by wildlife outside park boundaries. But they were here, deliberately hidden, their deaths covered up to protect the park's reputation and tourism income. Among them was Elizabeth Chen, age 24, missing since 1973. Michael O'Donnell, age 37, disappeared 1968. Rita Kowalski, age 19, last seen 1962. Each one had been reported missing while visiting Mammoth Cave. Each case had been investigated minimally and closed quickly. Each family had been told the cave system was too vast to search completely, that their loved ones had likely gotten lost and died in unreachable passages. The evidence Sarah Whitmore had documented was damning. Her photographs, which I had developed from the preserved film, showed not only the burial chamber but also signs of Park Service involvement. Equipment marked with park inventory tags, fresh batteries and emergency lights positioned to illuminate the chamber, clear evidence of regular access via a passage that was supposedly sealed and forgotten. Her notebook contained interviews she'd conducted with longtime park employees, off-the-record conversations about accidents that got cleaned up quietly, about missing hikers whose disappearances were swept away as quickly as possible, about pressure from park administration to minimize any incidents that might scare tourists. She'd connected the pattern that everyone else had ignored or been forced to ignore. I reported the discovery on July 17, 2003, to the National Park Service Regional Director, the FBI, and local authorities. The chamber was sealed as a crime scene. FBI forensic teams spent 2 weeks documenting everything. Families of the missing were contacted. It appeared justice would finally be served. Then the narrative changed. On August 12th, a joint statement from the FBI and Park Service announced the chamber contained bodies of historical significance, likely early cave explorers from the 1800s who had died in accidents. The preservation state was attributed to unique cave conditions. Sarah Whitmore's body was acknowledged, but her death attributed to tragic misadventure. She'd apparently entered the sealed passage alone and become trapped. The film from her camera was declared too degraded to develop. Her notebook was classified as part of an ongoing investigation and sealed from public access. The letter to the director was never mentioned in official reports. My photographs and documentation were confiscated as evidence and subsequently lost. Every piece of proof that demonstrated systematic cover-up disappeared into bureaucratic darkness. I was removed from the project on August 19, 2003, for violating evidence handling protocols, charges completely fabricated. My contract with the Park Service was terminated. Other team members who'd witnessed the chamber were reassigned to different projects scattered across the country. The entrance we'd opened was resealed with concrete, and the entire eastern extension was declared permanently closed to mapping operations for preservation reasons. The families were quietly offered settlements averaging $100,000 each, contingent on signing agreements not to discuss the circumstances or pursue further investigation. Most took the money, exhausted by decades of uncertainty. The Whitmore family refused initially, but after Robert Whitmore was audited by the IRS 3 times in 1 year, and Jason Whitmore lost his contracting license over suddenly discovered violations, they signed in 2005. I lost my professional reputation. Universities that had sought my expertise stopped returning calls. My published research was criticized and my methodologies questioned. My wife, Amira, stood by me, but the financial strain and constant harassment destroyed our health. She developed anxiety so severe she couldn't leave the house. We lost our home in 2006. I'm working as a high school science teacher in Arizona now, using my maiden name professionally. But I kept copies of those photographs, hidden where they'll never be found by the people who want them destroyed. 18 people were murdered or died because of negligence, and their deaths were covered up to protect tourism revenue that generates over $50 million annually for Kentucky. Sarah Whitmore tried to expose this. She died for it. Those 17 others deserved investigation, deserved justice, deserved their families knowing the truth. If you worked at Mammoth Cave between 1940 and 1985, if you know anything about the Devil's Corridor or the chamber burials, if you have information about how these cover-ups were coordinated, please come forward. These families deserve more than settlements and silence. The water level was rising exactly 4 inches every 12 hours in a cave system with no surface connection and no recent rainfall. I measured it personally 3 times between October 9th and October 11th, 2014, standing in knee-deep water in what locals called the Drowned Man's Cave in Wise County, Virginia. The consistency was impossible unless someone was deliberately pumping water into the system. The question that destroyed my career was horrifyingly simple. What were they trying to keep submerged? I'm Christina Volkov, certified cave rescue specialist and hydrologist with the Virginia Cave Rescue Team. I'd spent 12 years responding to cave emergencies, extracting injured spelunkers, recovering remains, mapping water systems in Appalachian cave networks. I'd seen tragic accidents and stupid mistakes, but I'd never seen evidence of mass murder until that October. The victim I can tell you most about is Jacob Townsend, though he was one of 23 men whose bodies I would eventually discover. Jacob was 49 years old in 1997, worked as a safety inspector for the Consolidated Mining Corporation, husband to Michelle Townsend, father of 2 sons, Kyle and Brandon. He was known for his meticulous reports and his refusal to overlook violations, even when pressured by management. His family reported him missing on June 14, 1997. The official investigation concluded he'd left voluntarily, walking away from his life after evidence suggested financial problems and marital stress. Evidence his wife insisted was fabricated. The truth was that Jacob Townsend had documented systematic safety violations at 4 mining operations across southwestern Virginia, violations that put miners at risk daily and threatened multi-million-dollar contracts if exposed. His detailed reports, photographs, and testimony would have shut down operations and sent executives to prison. Instead, he was taken to Drowned Man's Cave and executed along with 22 other men who'd become inconvenient. I was called to the cave on October 8, 2014, after 2 recreational cavers reported finding old equipment in a partially flooded passage. My initial assessment was routine. Document whatever they'd found, ensure it posed no hazard, update cave maps. What I found was a submerged chamber containing industrial mining equipment, personal effects, and clear evidence that the flooding was recent and artificial. The water was murky with suspended sediment, visibility less than 2 feet, even with high-powered dive lights. I spent 6 hours that first day mapping the flooded section, using sonar equipment to image the passages underwater. The sonar showed multiple large objects on the chamber floor, clustered in an area roughly 20 feet by 30 feet. The shapes were wrong for natural rock formations or abandoned equipment. I returned on October 10th with full cave diving gear and underwater photography equipment. The water had risen another 4 inches, confirming my measurements. Someone was actively managing this flood. I descended into the submerged passage and found them. 23 bodies, weighted down with mining chains, still wearing the work clothes they died in. The cold water and lack of oxygen had preserved them remarkably. Their faces were recognizable, their ID badges intact. Jacob Townsend's badge read, Chief Safety Inspector, CMC 447. His hands were bound behind his back with zip ties. Every single body showed the same binding pattern. They'd been systematically executed and dumped here, then the chamber had been deliberately flooded to conceal the evidence. The water level was maintained using an automated pump system I discovered hidden in an adjacent passage, powered by a generator in a sealed alcove, programmed to keep the bodies submerged regardless of natural water fluctuations. I photographed everything over 3 dives spanning 2 days. Each body, each piece of equipment, the pump system, the generator with its Consolidated Mining Corporation inventory tags still attached. I documented personal effects, wedding rings, wallets with photos, lunch boxes, safety equipment. These men had been at work when they were taken. Jacob Townsend's waterproof clipboard was still clipped to his belt. It contained his final safety report, dated June 13, 1997, documenting catastrophic structural failures at the Blackwood mine, falsified inspection records, and bribery attempts by mine management. His final note, written in grease pencil on waterproof paper, was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. June 13th. They know I have copies. Coming for me. Michelle, evidence in safe deposit box, First National Bank, account 8847, love you always. The other 22 victims were similarly documented. Environmental Inspector Martin Kovac, missing since 2001. Union organizer Tyrone Washington disappeared 1999. Geologist Sarah Kim, last seen 2003. OSHA investigator Patrick Quinn vanished 1995. Each had been investigating or documenting violations at Consolidated Mining Corporation operations. Each had family who'd been told they'd run away, taken bribes, left voluntarily. I surfaced on October 12th and immediately contacted the FBI, Virginia State Police, and the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration. I provided coordinates, photographs, video footage, detailed documentation. I believed I was exposing corporate murder on a massive scale. I believed 23 families would finally get answers. The response was swift, but not what I expected. On October 14th, FBI agents arrived and seized all my evidence, including my cameras, hard drives, and field notebooks. I was informed the site was now part of a classified investigation, and discussing my findings with anyone would constitute obstruction of justice. I was ordered to sign a non-disclosure agreement immediately. I refused. I contacted the families instead, starting with Michelle Townsend, who'd never stopped searching for her husband. I told her where Jacob was, what had happened to him, that he'd tried to protect her with his final message. She contacted the bank. The safe deposit box had been emptied in 1998, its contents seized by federal marshals, citing an investigation that never materialized. On October 20th, I was arrested for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and trespassing on private property. The cave system, I learned, sat on land owned by a subsidiary of Consolidated Mining Corporation. The criminal charges kept me occupied with legal defense while the cave was dealt with. According to official statements released in November 2014, a thorough investigation of Drowned Man's Cave revealed no evidence of human remains. The objects I'd identified as bodies were determined to be rock formations and debris misidentified due to poor visibility conditions. My photographs were dismissed as too unclear for positive identification, and my testimony was characterized as inconsistent with forensic findings. The cave entrance was permanently sealed with concrete in December 2014, ostensibly for public safety. The pump system I documented was never mentioned in official reports. The families were offered no information, no closure, no remains to bury. My criminal charges were dropped in February 2015 after I agreed to undergo psychiatric evaluation and accept that my findings were the result of stress-induced hallucinations. I was diagnosed with acute delusional disorder, and my cave rescue certifications were permanently revoked. My dive equipment was confiscated, and I was banned from entering any cave system in Virginia. Michelle Townsend tried to pursue civil litigation. Her lawyer was disbarred in 2016 for unrelated ethics violations discovered during the case. Her sons, Kyle and Brandon, both lost their jobs within 6 months. Kyle from a state highway department position, Brandon from a teaching job at public school. The family sold their home in 2017 and left Virginia. I'm living in Tennessee now, working as a desk clerk at a hotel, using my ex-husband's surname. But I kept encrypted backup files stored offshore, photographs and videos the FBI didn't know I'd uploaded before they seized my equipment. I'm reaching out because those 23 men are still down there, still weighted down in that flooded chamber, still hidden by corporate power and government complicity. If you worked for Consolidated Mining Corporation between 1990 and 2005, if you know what happened to safety inspectors who filed uncomfortable reports, if you have information about the Drowned Man's Cave flood system or the bodies submerged there, please come forward. 23 families deserve truth. Jacob Townsend's final message deserves to be heard. Someone else knows. Someone else remembers. The emergency exit tunnel had been filled with concrete from the inside. I discovered this on April 3, 2008, while conducting a routine safety inspection of the Chandler Cave tourist attraction in Tazewell County, Virginia. Every cave open to the public requires multiple exits for emergency evacuation. This one had an emergency tunnel that appeared functional on blueprints, but was actually blocked solid with concrete poured decades earlier. Someone had intentionally trapped everyone inside, and the reason became clear when I found what they'd been hiding in the closed sections. My name is Thomas Redfield, licensed structural engineer specializing in public safety compliance for entertainment venues. I'd been inspecting caves, amusement parks, and tourist attractions for 16 years, ensuring they met code requirements and posed no danger to visitors. I'd found violations before: inadequate lighting, poor ventilation, unstable structures, but I'd never found evidence that a tourist attraction had been used as a killing ground. The primary victim I can document is Amanda Carlisle, though there were 11 others I discovered that day. Amanda was 19 years old in 1983, college student at Radford University, studying elementary education, working summer jobs to pay tuition, described by friends as cheerful and conscientious. She was reported missing on July 28, 1983, after failing to return from a weekend trip to visit family. Her car was found abandoned at a rest stop on Highway 19, keys in the ignition, purse inside. The investigation concluded she'd been abducted by an unknown assailant, likely dead within hours. Her body was never found. The truth was that Amanda Carlisle had been working as a tour guide at Chandler Cave that summer, and she'd witnessed something the cave's owners couldn't allow her to report. She died in the sealed section along with 10 others who'd seen too much. Chandler Cave had operated as a commercial tourist attraction since 1957, offering guided tours through naturally formed limestone passages featuring impressive stalactites and underground pools. Approximately 40,000 visitors annually, generating substantial revenue for the Chandler family who owned and operated the site. The cave appeared professionally managed, with good safety records and positive reviews. I was conducting my inspection at the request of the State Tourism Board, routine assessment before permit renewal. The cave manager, Derek Chandler, grandson of the original owner, provided access and accompanied me through the tour sections. Everything appeared compliant until I examined the emergency exit system. The blueprints showed an emergency tunnel extending 300 feet from the deepest tour chamber to a hillside exit, installed in 1959 according to records. The interior door was clearly marked with lighted exit signs, but when I tested the door mechanism as part of my inspection protocol, it wouldn't budge. Derek explained it was stiff from disuse and offered to help. Together, we forced it open. The tunnel beyond was blocked solid after 15 feet. Concrete poured floor to ceiling, professionally finished, completely impassable. This wasn't degradation or collapse. This was deliberate sealing. I questioned Derek, who seemed genuinely shocked. He insisted the tunnel had been functional when he'd inspected it during his annual walkthrough. But the concrete was old, cured for years, probably decades. I examined the seal more carefully with my structural analysis equipment. The concrete was poured in 1983, based on composition analysis and curing patterns. Someone had blocked this emergency exit 45 years after it was installed, trapping everyone who might be in the cave if emergency arose, violating every safety code in existence. I informed Derek the cave would be immediately closed until the exit was restored. He agreed quickly, seeming cooperative. But I noticed his discomfort, the way his eyes kept drifting to a locked gate marked "Maintenance Only, No Public Access" at the far end of the main chamber. I asked to inspect that section as part of my comprehensive review. Derek's cooperation evaporated. He insisted that area was unsafe, unstable, never opened. I informed him that my inspection authority included all areas of the structure, public access or not. He made phone calls, delayed, created obstacles. I returned the next day with a state marshal and a warrant. The locked section extended deep into areas not shown on any public maps. The passages were stable, well-formed, and clearly had been accessed regularly. Fresh footprints in the dust, battery-powered lights installed, ventilation fans running. And 400 feet into the hidden section, I found the chamber. 11 bodies in various states of decay, some nearly skeletal, others more recently dead. They were positioned in a natural alcove, arranged carefully. Personal effects placed beside them like grave goods. Amanda Carlyle was identifiable by her employee uniform shirt, Chandler Cave Tours, Guide 17, and by her driver's license in her pocket. She'd been dead since 1983. The others ranged across 30 years. Jessica Montgomery, age 23, missing 1979. William Cross, age 37, disappeared 1985. Each had worked at the cave as tour guides, maintenance staff, or seasonal help. Each had been reported missing, with investigations going nowhere. Their families had been told they'd likely run away, started new lives elsewhere, wanted to disappear. Amanda's personal journal, preserved in the dry cave air, told the story. She'd discovered that Derek's father, Richard Chandler, was using the sealed section of cave for illegal dumping, toxic waste from local manufacturing, medical waste from a private clinic, even chemical weapons disposal contracted through shadowy military connections. The sealed emergency exit wasn't to trap tourists. It was to ensure that if anyone discovered the dumping operation, they'd have no escape route. Amanda had documented everything in her journal, planning to report to environmental authorities after her summer job ended. But Richard Chandler discovered her snooping on July 27, 1983. Her final entry, written in increasingly panicked handwriting, described being chased into the closed section, the door locked behind her, Richard's voice through the barrier telling her she should have minded her own business. She survived 4 days in the darkness before dying of dehydration. The other 10 had similar stories, documented in notes or implied by their circumstances. Workers who'd discovered the dumping, who'd asked too many questions, who'd threatened to go to authorities, all dealt with permanently. I documented everything: bodies, personal effects, Amanda's journal, the toxic waste drums still stored in deeper chambers, evidence of ongoing illegal activity. I contacted every authority I could think of: FBI, EPA, state police, federal prosecutors. I believed this was so egregious that justice was inevitable. The Chandler family had money and connections I didn't understand. Within 72 hours, my inspection credentials were suspended pending review of improper evidence collection procedures. The bodies I'd found were removed by federal agents, and the sealed section was thoroughly cleaned. When FBI forensic teams arrived days later for their official investigation, they found nothing. Derek and Richard Chandler were questioned and released. Their attorneys produced documentation showing the sealed section had been used for legitimate storage. The bodies I'd found were determined to be possible remains of historical significance, likely early settlers or native peoples. And my identification of Amanda Carlyle was disputed as speculative based on degraded evidence. Amanda's journal disappeared. My photographs were dismissed as too dark and unclear. The toxic waste I documented was never mentioned in official reports. On May 12, 2008, a federal investigation concluded that no credible evidence of criminal activity had been found at Chandler Cave. The site reopened to tourists in June 2008 after installing a new emergency exit system. I was fired from my engineering firm on June 3rd for bringing fraudulent and damaging accusations that harmed a legitimate business. My professional license was suspended for ethics violations. When I tried to contact the families of the victims, I found most had received anonymous settlements years earlier, payouts contingent on not pursuing missing person cases. Amanda's parents had died in the 1990s, never knowing what happened to their daughter. I lost my house, my marriage, my reputation. I'm driving trucks now, long-haul routes, constantly moving, still looking over my shoulder. Chandler Cave still operates, still brings in tourists, still makes money for the family that used it as a dumping ground and cemetery. Those 11 people died because they cared about doing the right thing. Amanda Carlyle was going to be a teacher. She wanted to make a difference in children's lives. Instead, she died alone in the dark because she wouldn't ignore poison being dumped into the groundwater that supplies 8 towns. If you worked at Chandler Cave between 1975 and 2010, if you know what really happened to the missing employees, if you have information about the dumping operations or the sealed section burials, please help. These families deserve truth. Amanda's journal should be in evidence, not destroyed. Someone remembers. Someone else knows. The cave rescue coordinates were off by 300 feet. I realized this on January 16, 2010, after spending 14 hours attempting to reach a supposedly trapped caver in the Seneca Caverns system in Pendleton County, West Virginia. The distress call had provided specific GPS coordinates for the victim's location, but when we finally broke through to those coordinates, we found no one. Instead, we found evidence of 7 previous rescue operations, all directed to the same wrong location, all missing their targets. Someone was systematically preventing cave rescues from succeeding, and the reason became clear when I found the real coordinates and what they led to. I'm Elena Suarez, paramedic and technical rope rescue specialist with the West Virginia Cave Rescue Service. I'd responded to 43 cave emergencies over 11 years, successfully extracting injured cavers, recovering remains, providing emergency medical care in the most challenging underground environments. I'd never lost a patient I could reach, but I'd never realized how many patients I'd been prevented from reaching. The victim that day was Nicholas Garrett, age 34, experienced caver and environmental geologist working for the State Department of Environmental Protection. He'd entered Seneca Caverns on January 15th for what should have been a routine survey of underground water quality, checking for contamination from surface mining operations. When he didn't emerge by evening, his wife Julia contacted authorities and provided his planned route and GPS beacon coordinates. We mobilized immediately. The rescue operation was complicated but not exceptional. Tight passages, vertical drops requiring rope work, cold water obstacles. My team consisted of 6 experienced cave rescuers, all veterans of difficult extractions. We followed Nicholas's GPS signal, which was transmitting clearly from approximately 800 feet below the surface in a section called the Limestone Corridor. Except when we reached those coordinates after 14 hours of difficult underground work, we found an empty chamber with no sign of Nicholas or any recent human presence. His GPS beacon was sitting on a rock ledge, deliberately placed, still transmitting. But Nicholas was gone. I examined the beacon carefully. It was functional, battery strong, clearly positioned intentionally. The chamber showed evidence of previous activity, old rope rigging, abandoned equipment, dated graffiti on the walls from multiple years. And scratched into the limestone wall near the beacon, almost invisible unless you knew to look, were coordinates: 38.8347 degree, 79.361 degree, followed by real location. They moved my beacon, Nicholas G. Those coordinates were 300 feet northeast of where we stood, in a section of cave not included on any official maps. I immediately radioed my findings to Surface Command and requested permission to redirect the rescue. I was ordered to return to the surface for debriefing. The operation was being called off. I refused. Nicholas was alive somewhere in this cave system, had deliberately left us coordinates, and needed immediate help. My team agreed. We redirected against orders and followed the new coordinates, entering unmapped passages that required significant technical climbing and tight squeeze work. We found Nicholas 4 hours later, trapped in a partially collapsed passage 750 feet below surface. He'd fallen approximately 20 feet, suffering a compound fracture of his left tibia and significant blood loss. He was conscious, hypothermic, in critical condition. But he was lucid enough to tell us his story before we began extraction. Nicholas had discovered something during his water quality survey, evidence of systematic illegal dumping of fracking waste into the underground water system supplying 14 towns across 2 counties. He'd documented contamination levels thousands of times above safe limits, photographed illegal pipes directing wastewater into natural cave streams, collected samples proving deliberate poisoning of public water supplies. When he'd called the surface to report his findings, his GPS beacon had been remotely accessed and reprogrammed to false coordinates, a capability he hadn't known existed in the rescue beacon system. Then the passage he was in had collapsed, not naturally but triggered by small explosive charges he'd heard detonating in sequence. Someone had tried to kill him and ensure any rescue operation would search in the wrong place. He'd managed to move before the complete collapse, leaving his compromised beacon behind with scratched coordinates as his only hope. He'd been trapped for over 20 hours when we found him, had lost dangerous amounts of blood, but his evidence was intact in a waterproof case strapped to his body. We extracted Nicholas over 8 hours of difficult technical rescue, finally reaching the surface at 6:47 a.m. on January 17th. We transported him immediately to Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, where he underwent emergency surgery. His evidence, water samples, photographs, documentation, I personally delivered to the FBI field office in Clarksburg. Nicholas survived the surgery and began recovery. I believed we'd saved his life and exposed a major environmental crime. I felt proud of my team's decision to disobey orders and follow the real coordinates. On January 19th, Nicholas Garrett died in his hospital room from what was officially ruled as complications from surgery and infection. But the nurse who'd been monitoring him, Rachel Kuntz, pulled me aside at the funeral and told me a different story. Nicholas had been recovering well, vital signs strong, infection controlled. Then 2 men in suits had visited his room, sent her away for privacy, and emerged 20 minutes later. Nicholas was dead within an hour, sudden cardiac arrest despite being on continuous monitoring. The evidence I delivered to the FBI was logged and subsequently lost in processing. The water samples were destroyed during routine evidence handling. The photographs were dismissed as insufficient to establish source, and the documentation was classified as part of an ongoing investigation that never produced any public results. I was formally disciplined by the Cave Rescue Service for insubordination and reckless endangerment in defying orders to abort the rescue. The fact that I'd found and saved Nicholas was irrelevant compared to my violation of command structure. I was suspended for 6 months without pay. During my suspension, I started investigating previous cave rescues that had failed or been called off. I found a pattern. 7 previous operations at Seneca Caverns alone, where GPS coordinates had led rescuers to empty chambers, where victims had never been found, where operations were eventually abandoned. 16 similar cases across West Virginia and Kentucky, cave systems spanning 8 years. I tried to reopen these cases, contacted families, requested reviews of rescue operation records. I discovered that many of the missing cavers had been environmental scientists, geologists, water quality specialists, people who would have reason to be surveying underground water systems and discovering contamination. On August 3, 2010, I was terminated from the Cave Rescue Service for continued insubordination in public statements damaging to the organization's reputation. My paramedic license was challenged on grounds of mental instability. Julia Garrett, Nicholas's widow, contacted me twice, then stopped responding after she received a settlement from the hospital for medical negligence in her husband's death. Rachel Kuntz, the nurse who'd witnessed the suspicious visit to Nicholas's room, was fired from Ruby Memorial for privacy violations after I'd convinced her to give a formal statement. She moved out of state. The two men in suits were never identified. I'm working as a home health aide in Ohio now, no longer doing rescue work, no longer involved in caving, but I kept records of those failed rescue operations, the pattern of GPS beacon manipulation, the list of missing environmental scientists whose bodies were never recovered. Nicholas Garrett risked everything to document poisoned water supplies. He survived the collapse and the exposure, only to be murdered in his hospital bed because the truth he'd found was too expensive to allow. If you worked for the West Virginia Cave Rescue Service between 2002 and 2012, if you remember rescue operations that led to wrong locations, if you know anything about GPS beacon tampering or the missing environmental scientists, please come forward. 16 people may have died because rescues were deliberately sabotaged. Nicholas Garrett's evidence should be in court, not disappeared. Someone else knows. Someone remembers. The chamber on the tourist map didn't match the chamber in the cave. I noticed this discrepancy on September 8, 2015, while conducting a geological assessment of Bristol Caverns in Sullivan County, Tennessee. The promotional materials showed a spacious chamber called the Cathedral, with impressive formations and comfortable viewing areas. The actual chamber at those coordinates was half the size, with significantly different rock formations. Someone had created a false chamber on every map, every brochure, every GPS guide for 15 years. And when I found the real cathedral chamber, I discovered why they'd been hiding it. My name is Alana Kunuk, geologist specializing in cave formation analysis and mineral surveys. I'd been contracted by the Bristol Caverns management to assess potential for expanding tourist routes and identify new formation displays. It was supposed to be straightforward commercial work, mapping beautiful caves for public enjoyment. Instead, I found a mass grave. The victim I can document most thoroughly is Christopher D'Angelo, though there were 14 others in that hidden chamber. Christopher was 27 years old in 2003, worked as a compliance inspector for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, engaged to his girlfriend of 4 years, Sarah Mitchell, planning a wedding for June 2004. He was reported missing on November 7, 2003, after failing to return from a routine inspection of Bristol Caverns' wastewater management systems. The investigation concluded he'd likely been in a car accident in a remote area. His vehicle never found, body never recovered. The truth was that Christopher D'Angelo had discovered the real cathedral chamber, understood what it meant, and was killed to protect a secret worth millions of dollars in tourism revenue. Bristol Caverns had operated since 1870, one of the oldest show caves in Tennessee, attracting approximately 65,000 visitors annually. The cave system featured spectacular formations, underground streams, and the famous cathedral chamber, at least according to marketing materials. The chamber visitors actually saw was impressive, but artificially enhanced with lighting, platforms, and subtle modifications to make it appear more dramatic than natural geology supported. I began noticing discrepancies on my second day of surveying. The dimensions in the tourist chamber didn't match geological surveys from the 1970s. The rock formations showed signs of recent modification, freshly broken stalactites, relocated flow stone, even some artificial formations created from concrete and paint. Someone had renovated this chamber to match what tourists expected to see. I examined the historical surveys more carefully. The original cathedral chamber, discovered in 1847, was described as vast natural vault, 90 feet height, remarkable acoustics, underground pool. The current tourist chamber was barely 40 feet high, with no pool. I cross-referenced coordinates from multiple historical documents and determined the real cathedral chamber should be located approximately 200 feet northwest of the current tourist route, in a section marked on modern maps as unstable and closed. On September 11th, I requested access to the closed section for geological assessment. The cave manager, Patricia Brennan, refused, citing safety concerns and insurance liability. I pressed the issue, noting that my contract included comprehensive access for full survey work. After multiple phone calls to corporate ownership, I was granted supervised access on September 14th. Patricia accompanied me personally, clearly uncomfortable. We navigated through passages that were perfectly stable despite their unsafe designation, past locked gates and warning signs, into sections that obviously received regular maintenance despite supposedly being closed for decades. And then we entered the real cathedral chamber. It was exactly as the 1847 description stated. Massive vault with 90-foot ceilings, extraordinary stalactite formations, underground pool of crystal-clear water. It was spectacular, worth featuring prominently in tourist routes. Except the underground pool wasn't clear. It was murky with dissolved organic matter, and floating near the surface were human remains. Patricia tried to pull me back, insisting we leave immediately, but I'd already seen enough. I waded into the pool with my survey equipment and documented 14 bodies submerged in the water, weighted down with industrial chains, preserved by the cold temperature and mineral-rich water chemistry. Some were recent enough to show flesh. Others were skeletal, but with clothing and identification intact. Christopher D'Angelo was identifiable by his TEDx inspector badge. Laminated and still legible after 12 years underwater. His waterproof inspection clipboard was strapped to his body, containing his final report dated November 7, 2003, documenting that Bristol Caverns was illegally dumping sewage and wastewater directly into the underground stream system that fed the cave's water supply, the same water that eventually reached surface streams supplying drinking water to 6 towns. His report concluded that contamination levels constituted an immediate health hazard, requiring emergency closure of the facility and criminal investigation of ownership. His final note, timed at 3:47 p.m., stated, "Patricia Brennan has offered $50,000 to reconsider findings. I declined and am leaving to file official report. If anything happens to me, this is where to look." The other 13 victims were similarly documented. Environmental Inspector Marcus Chen, missing since 1998. Journalist Angela Washington disappeared while researching a story in 2007. Geologist Thomas Erickson vanished during survey work in 2001. Each had discovered or was investigating the illegal dumping operation. Each had been murdered and disposed of in the hidden chamber, their bodies kept submerged in the underground pool where no one would search. Patricia stood at the chamber entrance, watching me document everything with my camera and sample collection equipment. She didn't try to stop me. She just made phone calls, her voice echoing in the vast space. "We have a problem. She's found it. All of it." I finished my documentation, collected water samples proving the contamination, photographed every body and every piece of evidence. I told Patricia I was going directly to authorities, and nothing she could offer would change that. She nodded sadly and said, "I know. I'm sorry for what happens next." I was arrested at the cave exit by Sullivan County Sheriff's deputies on charges of trespassing, evidence tampering, and desecration of human remains. My camera was seized. My water samples were confiscated. I was held for 72 hours while my documentation was systematically destroyed and my professional credentials were attacked. The official story released on September 17th stated that I'd entered a restricted area without authorization, contaminated a historical burial site containing remains of Native American individuals, and stolen artifacts for personal profit. The real cathedral chamber was described as a known archaeological site under protection orders, and my entry was characterized as destructive vandalism. Christopher D'Angelo's body was quietly retrieved and cremated before his family could be notified. The official identification was disputed. Dental records were deemed inconclusive, and DNA testing was never performed. His family was told that remains possibly matching Christopher had been found but couldn't be confirmed, and they should accept closure without certainty. The other 13 bodies were removed and classified as archaeological remains of indeterminate origin. No criminal investigation was conducted. No environmental testing was performed. Bristol Caverns remained open throughout, losing only 3 days of operation during what was described as routine maintenance. I was convicted of misdemeanor trespassing and evidence tampering in January 2016. My geological license was permanently revoked. My professional reputation was destroyed by coordinated media coverage describing me as an artifact thief who'd violated sacred burial grounds. Every university, every consulting firm, every potential employer rejected my applications. Sarah Mitchell, Christopher's fiancée, tried to pursue wrongful death litigation. Her lawyer was disbarred in 2017 for unrelated financial misconduct discovered during the case preparation. She gave up, broken by 15 years of uncertainty, followed by disputed remains she couldn't properly bury. I'm working at a grocery store in North Carolina now, stocking shelves at night, trying to remain anonymous. But I kept encrypted backup files uploaded before my arrest, photographs and documentation the authorities didn't know existed. Those 14 people died because they tried to protect public health. Christopher D'Angelo refused a bribe and lost his life for his integrity. If you worked at Bristol Caverns between 1995 and 2015, if you know about the real cathedral chamber or the illegal dumping operation, if you have information about the missing inspectors and investigators, please come forward. 14 families were denied truth and justice. The underground stream system is still contaminated. Tourists still visit, unaware they're standing above a cemetery. Someone remembers. Someone knows. The cave was officially closed for winter safety from November through March, but the equipment inside showed recent use. I discovered this on February 22, 2012, while conducting an unauthorized inspection of Linville Caverns in Burke County, North Carolina. As a cave safety consultant who'd worked on this site's permits, I knew the winter closure was mandatory due to hibernating bat populations and ice hazards. Yet when I entered through an emergency access point, I found fresh footprints in the dust, recently burned flares, and equipment dated to within the previous week. Someone was operating in the closed cave during protected season. The question that destroyed everything was what they were doing in there that required total privacy. My name is Victor Rostov, licensed cave safety consultant and wildlife biologist specializing in bat conservation. I'd worked with cave systems across the Appalachian region for 19 years, developing safety protocols that protected both human visitors and fragile cave ecosystems. Linville Caverns was one of my primary consulting clients, and I'd personally designed their seasonal closure procedures to protect a colony of 8,000 endangered gray bats. The victim I discovered first was Jennifer Huang, age 31 in 2008, worked as a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specializing in bat population surveys and cave ecosystem protection. Her family, parents David and Susan Huang, younger sister Michelle, reported her missing on January 18, 2008, after she failed to return from a routine bat colony survey at Linville Caverns. The official search found her car in the parking lot, her equipment staged at the cave entrance, but no trace of Jennifer herself. The investigation concluded she'd likely entered the cave against winter closure rules and become lost or injured in unmapped sections. The truth was that Jennifer Huang had discovered what was happening in Linville Caverns during closed season, and she'd been murdered to protect an operation worth millions in illegal wildlife trafficking. I'd been noticing irregularities in bat population counts at Linville for 3 years. The gray bat colony should have shown stable or growing numbers given the protected status and careful management. Instead, counts were declining steadily. 8,000 bats in 2009, 6,200 in 2010, 4,400 in 2011. Something was killing or removing bats during the closed season when no monitoring occurred and no one had legal access. I raised concerns with cave management and with Fish and Wildlife Service officials. I was told the decline was likely natural variation, disease, or climate factors. But the pattern was wrong. The bats weren't dying in the cave. Their bodies would have been found during spring reopening surveys. They were disappearing completely. On February 22, 2012, I used my emergency access credentials to enter Linville Caverns for an unauthorized inspection. The main bat hibernation chamber, which should have contained approximately 4,000 bats in winter torpor, held fewer than 1/500, and throughout the chamber were signs of recent disturbance, damaged rock formations, discarded equipment, collection nets, transport crates marked with Asian characters. I followed the disturbance signs deeper into the cave system, into sections that were off the normal tourist route but still mapped and stable. In a side chamber, 400 feet from the main hibernation area, I found Jennifer Huang. Her remains were partially skeletal, preserved by the cold, dry cave conditions. Her Fish and Wildlife Service uniform and identification were intact. Her equipment was scattered around her position as if she'd been working when attacked. And clutched in her skeletal hand was her field notebook, protected in a waterproof case containing documentation that explained everything. Jennifer had discovered the illegal operation on January 17, 2008, during what should have been a routine winter survey. She documented a sophisticated wildlife trafficking ring using Linville Caverns' closed season to harvest endangered bats for traditional Chinese medicine markets. Gray bats, worth $200, $500 each in overseas black markets, were being netted by the hundreds during hibernation when they were helpless, crated, and shipped internationally through a network she'd traced to organized crime connections. Her notebook contained photographs, shipping manifests she'd found discarded, license plates of vehicles she'd observed at the closed cave, and names of cave management staff she suspected were facilitating access. Her final entry, dated January 18th at 1:23 a.m., stated, "They know I'm here, heard voices calling my name, going deeper to hide, have evidence secured. If found, contact FBI, Agent Sarah Morrison, Charlotte Field Office." She'd been hunted through the cave system and killed. Her body had been left in a section considered too dangerous for normal tourist access, where it would never be found during routine operations. The winter closure had provided perfect cover. No visitors, no monitoring, no witnesses to what happened to her. Beyond Jennifer's remains, I found evidence of 8 other victims, scattered through various chambers in the closed sections. Wildlife enforcement officers, conservation volunteers, a journalist investigating trafficking, and 2 cave guides who'd apparently discovered the operation and been eliminated. 9 people total, killed across a span of 12 years to protect a multi-million-dollar illegal trade. Each had gone missing during winter closed season. Each investigation had concluded they'd entered the cave against closure rules and met with accidents or gotten lost. None of the bodies had been found because no one searched the closed sections thoroughly. The winter closure meant limited access even for rescue operations, and search teams focused on the main tourist routes where someone might reasonably become lost. I documented everything. The 9 bodies, Jennifer's notebook, the trafficking evidence, the recent equipment proving operations were ongoing. I photographed every detail with my cave survey camera. I collected samples of the bat colony showing signs of trauma consistent with mass netting operations. I spent 6 hours in that cave, gathering irrefutable evidence of murder and wildlife crimes. I exited through the emergency access and immediately drove to the FBI field office in Charlotte, requesting Agent Sarah Morrison by name as Jennifer's notebook had specified. I provided everything I'd found, including Jennifer's final documentation, and the location of all 9 bodies. The FBI conducted a raid on Linville Caverns on February 25, 2012, with full forensic teams and wildlife crime specialists. They found nothing. The closed sections I documented had been thoroughly cleaned. The 9 bodies were gone, removed in the 3 days between my discovery and the raid. Jennifer's notebook, which I'd left in place to maintain evidence integrity per FBI instruction, had disappeared. My photographs were analyzed and dismissed as inconclusive due to cave lighting conditions and image quality. My testimony was challenged on grounds that I'd entered the cave illegally, potentially contaminating evidence and violating federal cave protection laws. The trafficking operation I described was investigated and found to have insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. On March 8, 2012, I was arrested for unlawful entry into a protected cave system during closed season, disturbing endangered species habitat and violating federal wildlife protection regulations. The fact that I discovered 9 murder victims was deemed irrelevant compared to my violation of closure protocols. I was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. While I was incarcerated, my consulting business collapsed. My professional licenses were revoked. My wife, Tatiana, divorced me, unable to handle the stigma and financial destruction. When I was released in September 2013, I was unemployable in my field, blacklisted by every cave management organization, and under permanent monitoring by Fish and Wildlife Service for potential future violations. Jennifer Huang's family was told that possible remains had been located but were too degraded for positive identification, and they should accept that Jennifer had died in a tragic accident. The other 8 victims remained listed as missing persons. Their families never notified that bodies had been found. The gray bat colony at Linville Caverns continued declining. 200 bats in 2013, 800 in 2014. The cave still operates as a tourist attraction. The winter closure is still enforced, still providing perfect cover for operations that continue without oversight. I'm working as a night janitor in South Carolina now, cleaning offices, invisible to the world that destroyed me. But I kept encrypted copies of those photographs stored where they can't be erased. 9 people died trying to protect endangered species and expose organized crime. Jennifer Huang's last act was documenting the truth that everyone refused to see. If you worked at Linville Caverns between 2000 and 2015, if you know about the closed season operations or the wildlife trafficking ring, if you have information about the missing enforcement officers and conservationists, please come forward. 9 families deserve closure. The bat colony deserves protection. Jennifer's evidence should be in court. Someone remembers. Someone knows. The cave system was 90% mapped according to official records, with only minor unmapped branches remaining. But the seismic survey data I analyzed on June 3, 2017, showed massive unmapped chamber systems comprising nearly 40% of the total cave volume in Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, spanning Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. Someone had been falsifying exploration records for decades, deliberately keeping huge sections off the maps. When I finally accessed those hidden chambers, I understood why, and I found the 19 people who discovered the secret before me. My name is Natasha Volker, geophysicist specializing in subsurface mapping using advanced seismic and ground-penetrating radar technology. I'd been contracted by the National Park Service to conduct comprehensive geological surveys of Cumberland Gap cave systems before approving a major tourism expansion project. The mapping discrepancy I discovered wasn't an error. It was systematic falsification spanning 60 years. The victim I can detail most completely is Robert Sullivan, age 42 in 1997, experienced speleologist and professor of geology at Eastern Kentucky University, husband to Marie Sullivan, father of 3 children, Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. He led a research expedition into Cumberland Gap Caves in August 1997, mapping newly discovered passages for academic publication. His team of 6 researchers failed to return on August 23rd as scheduled. Massive search operations found no trace of Robert or his team members. All 7 were declared dead in a tragic caving accident, bodies presumed lost in inaccessible chambers. The truth was that Robert Sullivan's team had found the hidden chambers, understood what they contained, and were murdered to protect a secret that reached the highest levels of government. I noticed the mapping discrepancy while analyzing seismic survey data collected across the Cumberland Gap region. My equipment showed massive void spaces, chambers and passages of considerable size, in areas marked on all official cave maps as solid limestone. The volume was enormous, nearly doubling the known cave system size. This wasn't unmapped side passages. This was deliberate concealment of major chambers. I cross-referenced historical exploration records, academic publications, and Park Service mapping archives. Every document showed the same pattern. Exploration efforts that approached the hidden chambers were redirected, deemed too dangerous, or ended due to unstable conditions. Researchers who persisted in exploring those directions often disappeared from further publications, transferred to different projects, or, in disturbingly frequent cases, died in cave accidents. On June 7, 2017, I presented my findings to the Park Service Project Coordinator, asking for permission to conduct direct exploration of the unmapped regions. I was told the areas in question were geologically unstable and off-limits to all personnel. When I pressed the issue, citing the tourist expansion project's need for comprehensive mapping, I was informed my contract was being restructured and my access to the cave systems was suspended pending security review. I knew then something was very wrong. I'd worked with Park Service on dozens of projects. Security reviews for cave mapping were unheard of unless there were concerns about terrorism or vandalism. I'd given them no reason for suspicion, unless the accurate mapping itself was the threat. On June 12th, I entered Cumberland Gap through a remote entrance I'd identified using my seismic data, bringing full exploration equipment and 3 trusted colleagues who understood the risks: James Whitfield, cave rescue specialist, Sophia Ramirez, geologist, and David Chen, surveyor. We navigated using my seismic maps, finding passages that officially didn't exist, following void spaces that should have been solid rock. 6 hours into the exploration, we found the access point that had been hidden, a natural passage deliberately collapsed and camouflaged to appear like natural rockfall. Behind it was a massive chamber system, pristine formations, and evidence of extensive human activity spanning decades. The chambers contained military equipment, crates marked with Department of Defense labels, weapons storage, communications gear, supplies. This wasn't historical military use. The equipment was modern, maintained, some items dated within the previous 5 years. Cumberland Gap cave system had been used as a covert military storage facility, possibly weapons cache, possibly intelligence operations center, and it was still active. We found the bodies in the deepest chamber, the one my seismic data had shown as the largest void space. 19 people, positioned along the walls with evidence of execution, gunshot wounds to the back of the head, hands bound. Robert Sullivan's research team of 7 was there, identifiable by their university equipment and identification. His final notes, protected in a waterproof case, were dated August 22, 1997, describing their discovery of the military installation, their decision to report it, and their awareness that they were being followed through the caves. The other 12 victims included park rangers, geologists, spelunkers, even a congressman's aide, all people who'd apparently discovered the hidden chambers over 60 years in a covert operation. Each had been eliminated to protect the secret. Their bodies had been left in the deepest chamber as a warning or simply because removal was unnecessary when no one could reach this far without already knowing the secret. I photographed everything: the military equipment, the bodies, Robert's notes, the evidence of ongoing operation. My team spent 4 hours documenting the chambers before beginning our exit. We knew we were in extreme danger, but we believed we could reach authorities before being stopped. We emerged from the cave on June 13th at 3:27 a.m. and were immediately surrounded by armed personnel. Not Park Service rangers, but military operators in tactical gear with no identifying insignia. Our equipment was seized. Our documentation was confiscated. We were held in military custody for 6 days, questioned extensively, and threatened with federal charges under national security statutes. On June 19th, we were released after signing non-disclosure agreements under the Espionage Act, acknowledging that violation would result in immediate federal prosecution and decades in prison. We were told the chambers we'd found were part of classified national security operations authorized at the highest levels, and our discovery, while unfortunate, would be buried under security protocols that superseded all other considerations, including murder investigations. The bodies we'd found were dismissed as classified personnel casualties from historical Cold War operations, and their removal and disposition was classified. Robert Sullivan's family was not notified. The other 18 victims' families received no information. The hidden chambers were resealed, and the false maps remained official record. I honored the non-disclosure agreement for 6 years, terrified of federal prosecution. But in 2023, James Whitfield died of cancer, and on his deathbed he told me he couldn't stay silent anymore. His death released me from my own fear. Sophia and David support this disclosure, understanding the consequences we may face. 19 people were executed to protect a secret military operation being run illegally in a national park. Robert Sullivan's wife died in 2019, never knowing what happened to her husband and his team. His children grew up believing their father abandoned them or died in an accident he could have prevented. The truth is, he was murdered by his own government for discovering something he had every right to know about. I'm prepared for what comes next. Arrest, prosecution, prison. But this truth needs to be public. If you worked at Cumberland Gap National Historical Park between 1950 and 2020, if you know about the hidden chambers or the classified military operations, if you have information about the missing researchers and rangers, please come forward. 19 families deserve truth. The public deserves to know what's being hidden beneath national park land. Someone in government remembers. Someone authorized this. Someone needs to answer.